Hi there, I'm Doug Furr, author of the Eruption universe and related works, and welcome to my channel. The following video is going to be narrated by a text-to-speech engine. I suffer from a speech impediment which makes it very difficult for me to read off script without either stuttering, or repeating over myself, as you just saw right there. The text-to-speech engine is made using my own voice, and the content that the text-to-speech engine will be narrating is entirely my own and not AI generated. I think it's possible to say no to things like AI generated slop and environmental destruction while also saying yes to the careful use of technology that helps people with disabilities communicate and lead a more fulfilling life. I appreciate you approaching my videos with an open mind, and I hope you enjoy the show. Thank you for watching.
Eruption, Part 3, Secession. Today we will discuss the so-called Western Revolution and the secession of the West Coast. As mentioned in the last few episodes, the Yellowstone eruption completely destroyed the road, rail, and telecommunication links across the Rocky Mountains, and the ash and volcanic gases made air travel across the Northern Hemisphere impossible. Even satellite and HF radio communication was virtually impossible due to the amount of ash and gases in the atmosphere. This made the population west of the Pacific Coast Ranges effectively isolated from the rest of the country. It was theoretically possible to send ships through the Panama Canal and/or fly aircraft far south across Brazil or Argentina and then north. However, the breakdown of systems within the U.S. and Americans' attempt at consolidating power in the East meant there simply wasn't much of anything for the East to send. A few military cargo aircraft made it to Alaska and back via a transpolar route. However, ingestion of the ash in the atmosphere severely damaged the engines. Further flights were canceled to prevent additional damage. While the West was just as surprised at Yellowstone erupting as the rest of the nation was, they were slightly more prepared for the aftermath. The states on the West Coast were no strangers to volcanic and seismic activity, with recent examples being the Mount St. Helens eruption of 1980, the San Fernando earthquake of 1971, and the near-constant volcanism of the Hawaiian Islands. After these events, the western states began to invest in disaster recovery and emergency preparedness. Ironically, they were some of the best prepared states for this type of disaster, yet were spared most of the worst devastation. They were not spared completely, however, as eastern Oregon and Washington received significant ashfall, crippling the cities of Spokane and Ontario, along with countless other small towns on the Intermountain Plain. An unusually strong Pineapple Express weather system, making landfall on December 16th, the day after the eruption began, brought strong westerly winds from the Pacific and several inches of precipitation. This warmer, wetter air collided with the cooler, ash and sulfur-filled air from the east over the Pacific Coast Ranges, which in turn led to record-breaking blizzards in the Cascades and Sierra Nevadas, further isolating the population centers on the Pacific Coast. There would have been disruptions in the West, don't get me wrong, but the situation would have been much more manageable than in the East. Power would have been restored in days, not weeks or months. Highways and railroads going north and south would have still been intact. Phone and data cables along the coast would still be operable. Of course, most national institutions, such as banking, were cut off from the rest of the U.S. While the economy collapsed in the West, society did not. Most people had no idea of the extent of the devastation in the East, as there was no reliable means of getting information from east of the mountains. Even as the mountain passes were cleared and refugees from the Intermountain region began trickling in, unless one had come directly in contact with them, the news spread slowly. The state governments and local institutions stepped in quickly to fill the power vacuum left by the federal government. As soon as the power grid began being restored, grocery stores were deputized to distribute food and supplies. Gas stations were closed to the public to ration fuel for emergency vehicles and supply trucks, and local credit unions pooled their assets together to create a local currency in absence of the Federal Reserve. By the end of March 1986, life on the West Coast had actually returned to a sense of normalcy for most people. Those employed by local businesses were back at work and taking home paychecks of the new Pacific dollar to cash at their neighborhood credit union. Oil pumped and refined in Southern California was sent northward and loaded onto tankers to be sent to Hawaii. While food was never plentiful, enough had been stockpiled from the harvest of 1985 that, combined with the sea harvest and fresh produce imports from Central and South America, food insecurity was never an issue. Even ships from across the Pacific were docking at the ports, and contact with East Asia was maintained through undersea cables. The ones who were suffering the most were those employed by either the federal government or businesses headquartered east of the mountains. In many cases, friends and neighbors would band together to make sure they had food in their pantries and a roof over their heads. The largest group of federal employees, however, were the military personnel stationed at the many bases and installations on the West Coast. With communication no longer being possible with the East, they were left without orders or even guidelines for what to do next. State National Guard units were immediately mobilized to assist in the recovery efforts and logistical support, but the bulk of the military simply remained at their posts. The weeks turned to months, and still no new orders, no resupply shipments, no pay, no leave, and most importantly, no word from loved ones in the East. In the absence of other orders, some commanders took it upon themselves to offer their units assistance to the state's National Guards. The Guardsmen gladly accepted the help, and the troops were more than happy to assist in exchange for a hot meal. As April began, discipline began to break down. Desertions and troops going AWOL became commonplace, and in some cases, lower-ranked personnel had to resort to stealing food and/or panhandling as supplies ran out, particularly in Hawaii. The officers, also starving and exhausted, could do little to maintain order. Recall from Part 2 that by mid-April 1986, some communication between the federal government in the East and the West Coast was possible. Ironically, despite being the furthest, Hawaii was the first state to make contact through satellite communication. Upon hearing of the dire situation the military was facing in the islands, the Secretary of the Navy ordered the ships of the U.S. Pacific Fleet that had been forward deployed in Japan and Guam, who had also been out of contact with command until this point, to load up on supplies and set sail for Hawaii to restore order. On April 30th, President Reagan's address to the West Coast had been transmitted to Hawaii, who then in turn broadcast it to the rest of the West. The speech was laden with neoconservative political rhetoric and delivered in a condescending tone, culminating in the infamous lines, "Allowing the government to meddle in the rebuilding efforts in the West will do nothing but increase bureaucracy and ultimately the cost of rebuilding. Furthermore, it will lead to a culture of dependence on government institutions and an addiction to spending other people's money to solve your problems." Reagan's speech was met with outrage up and down the West Coast. After hearing nothing from their elected officials for months, the people were not in the mood to be lectured to about responsibility, especially when their own states had fared better than the East during the disaster. Agitated citizens began to question why they should remain in the United States if they were seemingly going to be abandoned, especially when their own state governments seemed to be doing a much better job at managing the crisis than the feds were. They took their frustration to the town halls, the offices of their state representatives, and the offices of their national senators and representatives, who themselves had now been ousted from the halls of Congress. Elected officials from across the political spectrum began to advocate for secession. By the end of May, massive demonstrations were being organized at federal buildings demanding either readmittance or that the states be allowed to peacefully secede. In many cases, they were spearheaded by the former congressional representatives or even the state governors. These were almost exclusively peaceful protests. Obviously, having the state governments participating in the demonstrations discouraged any mischief. But, facing significant unrest in the East, the federal government was not going to take any chances and ordered federal law enforcement to, quote, put down the rebellion. What the feds had failed to realize, however, is that many of the federal employees they had tried to deputize were already on the other side of the picket line, their struggles in the past few months erasing any loyalty they had to Uncle Sam. So, they tried to federalize the National Guard next, but the state governors refused to comply, and the guardsmen rallied around their states. Many unit commanders staged, quote, second swearing-in ceremonies, where they pledged their allegiance to the state constitutions and the governors. Outraged, President Reagan himself now ordered the military to quash the uprising. The orders were first received by Naval Base San Diego on June 15th and were met with immediate outrage. The last thing the sailors wanted to do was harm the very citizens who had opened their homes and the National Guardsmen who they were sharing meals with. The base commander himself made the bold move of declaring the orders to be unlawful and sent the daring reply, quote, "If I'm wrong and the order is lawful, you are welcome to cross the lava fields to bring me in for a court-martial." The San Diego naval mutiny began as the captains of the warships docked in the harbor began striking the stars and stripes and raising the bear flag. The orders were transmitted up the coast, along with the response from Naval Base San Diego, and slowly, more and more installations began to join the mutiny. It spread north to the Bay Area and Travis Air Base, and east through the desert to Edwards Air Base. When the message reached Naval Station Everett, the captains lowered Old Glory and replaced it with the Jolly Roger, a move soon echoed by the submarines at Bangor Base, along with the soldiers and airmen stationed at Fort Lewis and McChord Air Force Base. The mutiny culminated July 4, 1986, when the governor of California delivered a speech from the deck of the USS Kitty Hawk, declaring the Republic of California as a sovereign nation and independent of the United States. The next day, the governors of Oregon and Washington announced the Northwestern Constitutional Convention. It would take most of the rest of the month for the new Constitution to be drafted, but the Cascadian Confederation would officially declare independence July 30th. The only major U.S. military installation not to join with the mutineers was Camp Pendleton. The base was surrounded and involved in a week-long siege that was finally broken when the California Navy hijacked the USS Missouri from Long Beach Naval Shipyard, where she was undergoing a refit, to be brought back into service. I've posted the full story on my profile if you'd like to read exactly how it went down, but in short, they towed it down the coast and pounded the Marines back to the Stone Age. There was no further resistance to the new nations after that. It is also worthy of mention at this point that the new nations now possessed a sizable arsenal of nuclear weapons liberated from Bangor Subbase and various air bases along the coast. These would be crucial as acting as a deterrent against American aggression going forward. Speaking of American aggression, they were of course not too happy of the Western states declaring independence. On August 2nd, the majority of the U.S. Pacific Fleet set sail from Honolulu towards California, leaving a skeleton fleet consisting of a cruiser and a few destroyers and frigates as escort. One can imagine their surprise when on August 3rd, Hawaii declared independence and the Hawaiian monarchy was restored. The fleet continued sailing east, as the west coast was the much greater threat at the moment. As the fleet approached the coast, however, they were ordered to hold fire. The U.S. realized what a very precarious situation they were in. They had already lost a sizable percentage of their fleet to the rebels, including an aircraft carrier, battleship, an amphibious assault ship, and numerous ballistic missile submarines. If they were to engage these rebels, they would not only still lose most of these ships, but also risk the remaining Loyalist ships of the Pacific Fleet. There was also the possibility of the Loyalist ships defecting and joining the rebellion if the battle turned in the rebels' favor. Plus, on top of that, they also risked nuclear war and a second environmental disaster on top of Yellowstone. The West Coast dared not fire first either, as they didn't want to lose any of their new ships or sailors. Besides, neither side was particularly keen on opening fire on their former friends and comrades, as the order to attack their fellow Americans was the tipping point that started the revolution to begin with. The ensuing naval standoff became jokingly known as the Battle of the Channel Islands and lasted for about a week. The U.S. Air Force also attempted to send aircraft from Alaska, but, as with previous attempts, ash in the upper atmosphere forced them to turn back before their aircraft were completely destroyed. By mid-August, the order had been given for the Pacific Fleet to set a course for the Panama Canal and their new home ports on the East Coast. With so much internal strife east of the Rockies, the U.S. was in no position to continue the fight. Reaction from the rest of the world was mixed. The communist world was of course elated at the breakup of the United States and immediately recognized all three new nations. Most other countries did not recognize them, however, and they were not granted admittance into the United Nations. Although this attitude would slowly begin to change as the new nations developed economically, the struggle for recognition would continue through the 2010s. Again, this is a topic I plan on discussing in greater detail in the future. So at this point, I'm sure there's some of you that are a bit disappointed at how anticlimactic the secession actually was. There was no grand Second Civil War or glorious revolution. Instead, it was a slow, largely peaceful movement punctuated by grand speeches and a few firefights. I would imagine in-universe commentators and historians would refer to it as a civic snore rather than civil war. This is very much intentional on my part. As I stated in the introductory episode, really the only way I can foresee a secessionist movement succeeding would be in a scenario where the Eastern government is too weak or distracted to respond, thus eliminating any potential for conflict. Let us not forget that the U.S. had lost over half its territory and over a third of its population at this point, and they would realize that any further losses would be unsustainable. That is, of course, even if the U.S. military was even willing to take up arms against fellow Americans, which, as we've seen, was not guaranteed. Even when we look at real history, many well-known examples of revolutions or breakaway movements tend to be more civic affairs punctuated by moments of action. German reunification was a characteristically civil event that featured a few symbolic moments of the Berlin Wall coming down. In fact, one can easily draw comparisons with the fall of the Eastern Bloc and Western secession. Again, this is intentional on my part. Perhaps the conclusion we can make is that in order for a peaceful revolution to succeed, the apparatus of the state must be degraded to the point that it can no longer use the threat of violence to silence the revolutionaries. Things must get worse before they get better. A sobering thought indeed. Until next time, Doug Furr.